Good evening, everybody. My name is Keith Burnett. I'm the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Sheffield, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this evening to this very event. The Sheffield Political Economy Research Institute is something that I am and the university is particularly proud of. And I'm no more proud actually to be here to launch the book of Colin and Tony Payne, and also, I should say, many other distinguished contributors in the book. I'm very proud of it for a range of reasons. I think the first thing is that I think we'd all agree that there's an urgent need for a rethink of our political economy, not just in the country, in the world. And I hope my colleagues in politics will excuse me for thinking that much of the debate that we're hearing at the moment is rather sterile. Because it isn't actually addressing the key things that we see that have gone wrong, the difficulties we have, whether it's from climate change, whether it's from an unequal distribution of resources, whether it's from unfairness. And I think the thing that really strikes me most about it is the way people talk as if we're trapped. You know, we're trapped in a particular weather, we're trapped in a particular circumstance that isn't of our making, we can't do anything about. And when I was doing this, I was reading the Labour Party Manifesto of 1918, as you do. Because the present one's pretty boring, so they go back to something a bit more interesting. So it demanded the gradual building up of a new social order based not on internecine conflict, inequality of riches and dominion over subject classes, but on the deliberately planned cooperation in production and distribution and exchange, the sympathetic approach to a healthy equality, the widest possible participation in power, both economic and political, and the general consciousness of consent, which characterize a true democracy. Now that would be wonderful if we had that, but we don't. And I would say that it's not enough. It's not enough to build a new system, or just replace the present system we have. What this book says, by its authors, and particularly Colin and Tony, is actually you need moral purpose. You can't go ahead and just rebuild an economy on a base of a new set of tricks and a new set of methods. You have to have purpose. And I think it's no better place to announce and launch the book in a place that is completely redolent of civic purpose. What we see around us is a building and associated with a council and other parts of what you do in the city, John, welcome here, Chief Executive, that have to do with moral purpose, of providing things for people, whether it's parks, schools, all the things that go with it. And if we try to think we can trick ourselves that there's just some independent political realities out there that we can't work on, that we can't build, we're stuffed. And actually what this book does is explain really how we have to go back to the moral purposes, to the civic purposes, and rebuild the type of economy that we really need. So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you here on behalf of the university and of the city, and to talk about this book, its civic purpose, and with that civic purpose, all the things now that we know need to go with it about real sustainability, but ask it's not just of simple economics, but got to do with an economy that must be based on fairness, sustainability for our planet and our cities. So on that, I'm going to ask, I think now, I've welcome indeed, and I'm going to ask, I think it's Colin first of all, Professor Colin Haig, co-director of Speriusm, to say a few words about these things. So it's a very big welcome to you, Colin, as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. I've not been to many book launches, and I must confess this is the first time I've been to a book launch for a book that I've been involved with, either as an author or a co-author or editor or
a groupies of years.
What have you. Well, so I wanted to start by thanking you, because I don't want to say it's a highlight of my career to have a book launch, but it's very, very nice, and it wouldn't be possible without you. Well, I mean, it would be possible, but it would be a rather sadder occasion. Tony and I were speaking to ourselves about civic capitalism. We've done quite a lot of that. Some of that made way into this book. So thank you for being here. And I want to start with a few other words of thanks too. The book launch would not be possible without you. The book would not be possible without the help of a number of people. First, I want to thank Tony. I think he pushed me and us collectively to move beyond the kind of critique of the capitalism that we have, which is the kind of easy part, towards at least a dialogue, a discussion, a conversation about what an alternative capitalism that we could build from here might look like in this country, that would respond to the crisis we've had and build that response from an analysis, the kind of analysis we've built of the crisis itself. We struggled with the term, I think it was Tony's idea, the civic capitalism. I think that's a good concept for the conversation. The book's about the conversation. In the end, I think I probably pushed him to turn it into a book, but that kind of shows the kind of writing partnership that we've had, the partnership here. And I certainly couldn't have written this book without him. I hope he couldn't have written it without me. It's a different book for that co-authorship, and that's been very important. I also, the second thing is that this is a Sperry book in a way too. In a way, the book is an embodiment of the kind of the spirit of Sperry and the ideas which have animated that. We set ourselves up, I think, in an attempt to build that kind of conversation about the kind of capitalism we should have and how that capitalism would have to adapt itself to the crisis that we witnessed and arguably carries on today, and also the wider environmental crisis that we also have. So this is very, very much, it's not the manifesto of Sperry, but it's a book which could have not have been written without Sperry and the Sperry Partnership, the group of large number of people around Sperry. So although they didn't all contribute directly to the text, they contribute and are there in the text and some of the ideas that we discuss and develop. And finally, on my thank yous, I want to thank the Vice-Chancellor, I want to thank Keith. I woke up this morning and I thought, gosh, it really is amazing. I'm going to this book launch, my first book launch, and not only will my Vice-Chancellor be there, but he'll actually be presiding over this book launch. Now, I think that says a number of things. It says something about this university, it says something about our Vice-Chancellor, it says something in particular about the way in which he has supported Sperry from the start. It was Ed Miliband in our opening lecture talked about Sperry as the right idea at the right time. I won't say Ed Miliband necessarily gets everything right, but I hope in a way he got that right. And in a sense, civic capitalism is a response to that challenge in a way, to kind of think about what kind of a capitalism we need. So thanks to all of those people for all of that. I'm going to be very brief because it's a book launch and it's not appropriate to rehearse the arguments of the book. Obviously, in one sense, we hope you will read the book. But I want to introduce at least some of the ideas, but I want to introduce them in a slightly different way to the way in which we introduced them in the book. I want to talk in particular about inequality. I want to argue that inequality is, if you like, the elephant in the room in this general election. It's the elephant in the polling booth. It's rife, it's rising, it's likely to get worse, regardless of who wins this election, and it forms the backdrop to the election campaign, I think. Yet, no party seems able to talk directly about it. That, I think, is where we find ourselves today. But that's not terribly surprising, for to draw attention to inequality directly in that way would be to demand a response. And I think the chilling reality is that, committed as all the principal parties now are, as their manifestos make clear, to the old growth model of debt-fueled and consumption-driven growth, the next government is almost bound to preside over a further intensification of precisely the social and economic inequalities which have been exacerbated since the crisis. We know from reading Thomas Piketty and others that even before the crisis the figures were truly dreadful. The top percentile capturing a staggering 15% of total income in 2008 and a mind-bending 30% of total wealth. But the point is that things have only gotten worse. That was 2008, and he contrasts those figures with the earlier figures from the 1980s, and the growth in inequality is staggering. But he doesn't have the most recent data, and the most recent data would be worse than this. For what we know definitively is that the response to the crisis in Anglo-liberal states like Britain has been essentially twofold. Austerity on one hand, and an ever more concerted and frenetic attempt to re-secure the conditions of asset price and hence wealth appreciation on the other hand. And it's not at all difficult to see where that leads. Austerity on the scale and to the time frame that all of our major political parties are signed up to, particularly in the absence of stable growth and rising taxation receipts, can only result in public welfare spending restriction. And of course, it's precisely those public spending programs which are most at risk and which our politicians tell us least about where they intend to cut from, that were responsible for compensating the already poor for the rising social inequality that they've come to experience in the 1980s and has now been exacerbated in the period since. In short, austerity itself is regressive redistribution. It is redistribution from the poor to the affluent. It's an inequality multiplier. But that's only half the story. For having bailed out the banking sector with public funds whilst demanding essentially nothing in return, recent government economic policy has focused principally on resecuring the conditions of asset price and notably house price inflation, with some degree of success. The consequence is that those with accumulated assets, with wealth in other words, are the key beneficiaries of the post-crisis public policy regime which is now in place and which is consolidated and wrapped into the manifestos of most of the political parties in this general election campaign. So those with assets are set to benefit in proportion to the assets that they already have or hold or have the resources to acquire. That, too, is staggeringly inegalitarian. If you're in any doubt, just think about the Russian oligarch with depreciating rubles enjoying last year a 30% return on his or her investment in the London housing market with no capital gains tax liability. This is not asset-based welfare, as we're often told, nor is it even trickle-down economics, as we're always told, because the trickle has turned into a torrent, and the torrent is raging upstream. And that's just one example. One example of the world of the Anglo-liberal capitalism after the crisis, which looks remarkably like Anglo-liberal capitalism before the crisis, only in some sense worse. So is there an alternative? Well, we think so. There has to be an alternative in a sense, and the alternative we propose is what we call civic capitalism. In short, the governance of the market by the state in the name of the people to deliver what they wish for: collective public goods, equity, social justice, civic virtue in a sense. Its core and defining ethos reverses the long-standing logic of the Anglo-liberal world in which citizens have been made to answer to the perceived logics of the capitalism they've been required to serve. That reversal, that not that we serve the market, but we make the market serve us for public purpose, is not only, we would argue, intensely desirable. In the end, it's absolutely necessary. It's the only way we can solve our planetary crisis, actually. The crisis shows us that we can no longer be driven by the perceived imperatives of the old model, and those who have claimed for a very, very long time, and it turns out quite falsely, to be able to discern for us the needs of the market and then to make us dance to the tune of those needs. It's time, if you like, to ask not what we can do for capitalism, but what capitalism can do for us as citizens of a democratic society. That, if you like, is the mantra of civic capitalism. So how do we get to this conclusion? Well, very briefly, from an analysis of the crisis itself. Before the crisis, mainstream economists, mainstream commentators and policymakers alike largely convinced themselves that the market was synonymous with economic efficiency and was essentially self-regulating. It was best if left to its own devices. There was little, if anything, that the state was capable of providing that was not better delivered through the fair play of market mechanisms. And this, of course, had major consequences. But once we acknowledge that markets are neither self-regulating nor self-equilibrating, and the crisis is surely the clearest evidence of that, we understand that market conformity is not so much the key to growth as the guarantor that any such growth will prove ultimately unsustainable, that growth ends in crisis. The state now emerges as integral to growth, but more importantly, integral to the character and sustainability of that growth. The state has to take responsibility for the kind of growth we have and its sustainability in the future. It's the only body capable of regulating the market, and such regulation is both the only means by which capitalism's propensity for crisis can be held in check, and the only means by which the market can be made to answer to the citizens it should be made to serve. The state, perhaps particularly in Britain, has never had a very good record of market regulation, and the dangers of state failure shouldn't be undersold. But we simply can't afford to assume that markets contain the capacity to regulate themselves, and in so doing allow them effectively to regulate us. That, I would argue, is the situation in which we find ourselves today. The market then is never and can never be a guarantor of equity or justice. Consequently, if we are to have social and economic justice or equity, it has to be imposed upon the market by the state in our name. That is the very nature of civic capitalism, the governance of the market by the state in the name of the people to deliver collective public goods, equity, social justice. This might sound a little bit like a statist ideology in which we entrust to the state without question all that we previously assumed the market would provide for itself. But it's not that. What it is, I think, is a conscious rejection of the assumption of the benign and self-equilibrating nature of market rationality in favour of a more civic and democratic form of economic governance. Together, as citizens of a democratic society, we need to ask not what we can do for the market, but what we wish the market to do for us. But sadly, it seems, we'll have to wait at least one more election before we're going to have the chance to vote for such a capitalism at the ballot box. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Colin. Now, Tony Payne's. First, Tony Payne's going to the other partner in the book, as well as Andrew Gamble, actually, one of the other contributors here in the audience.
Well, thank you, Sue, from me to all of you for coming, and I too can confirm that Colin is a very, very easy colleague, friend and writer to work with. It's been one of the nicest collaborations I've ever been involved in. I want to devote my remarks to something just a little bit different, to take the story outside of Britain to the wider world. And I probably shouldn't begin by saying this, especially at the book launch of a book that I'm one of the co-authors, but the bit of the book that I really like best is actually the bit that Colin and I didn't do. The bit in the middle, part 2, where we've asked 7 or 8 or 9 critical friends, I suppose you'd call them, to comment on what we wrote, on the model that we set out in part 1, which Colin so deftly summarised. And the reason I like it is that these commentators have immediately started a debate about civic capitalism. It's not just Colin and I throwing some ideas out. We're already getting reactions, commentary, criticism. And the criticisms made of us are really very, very interesting. Let me just share some of them with you. Fred Block, writing from California, for example, thinks that we cop out by deploying what he calls the pleasant word civic, and that we end up therefore underemphasising the need for a real deepening of democracy. Gavin Kelly from the Resolution Foundation in London wants us instead to put civic more into the mix and to explain more thoroughly what we mean by civic. Ian Goff thinks that we haven't taken fully enough on board the scale of the looming environmental crisis, even though we tried to do that. Anne Pettifer asserts that we haven't sufficiently escaped the neoliberal mindset because we still use neoliberal words like regulation, growth and globalisation. Ruth Levitas notes with some disappointment, although we have to say accurately enough, that we're not Marxists, and she takes us to task for not doing enough to frighten the horses, which is her phrase. Most subtly and in a way most tellingly and hurtfully of all, Mick Moran, a member of our own Sperry International Advisory Board, says that although we are, he generously puts it like this, although we are, he says, two very distinguished political scientists, we say very little in the book about politics, and specifically about the key issue of who is going to be the driver of this new civic capitalist vehicle that we have conjured up in our minds. And to be honest, in response to all of that, I think, not all of it, most of that perhaps, I think Colin and I would probably say we broadly agree, up to a point, Lord Copper, anyway, as Evelyn Moore once put it. So much so that I actually thought it might be interesting to devote my remaining remarks to a continued criticism of the book and an exposure of the area in it that I think actually we need to do most to develop and to take further. It's probably not good form at the launch of your own book, but I'm up here and the microphone's on and I'm going to do it. In my view, what we still need to do quite a lot more thinking about and research about is how civic capitalism in Britain, or for anywhere else for that matter, in any other country for that matter, might be successfully embedded as opposed to being comprehensively undermined by the manner of its insertion into the contemporary global order. Now, I don't want to be too harsh on us, because we do at least raise this question in the book, and we raise that question when an awful lot of even quite good commentary on the British political economy purports to believe that Britain remains some sort of autonomous island capable of making free choices about the type of political economy it would like. So what do we say on this front? Well, we take the view that the kind of civic capitalism that we propose would be stillborn were it to emerge and be thought of and be pursued purely at a national level. To adapt an old Stalinist phrase, civic capitalism in one country is an oxymoron. Or to put it slightly differently, the conditions of existence of civic capitalism are not exclusively, perhaps not even principally, domestic in character. In other words, we have to pay attention to the matter of how we think about, and then how we reconfigure, if we can, what is usually called the system of global governance, the governance of the global political economy. And by that phrase we refer loosely and simply to the mix of arrangements, institutions, rules, some direct, some indirect, that do now exist at the global level with a view to giving some coherence, some orderliness to the diverse mix of policies and approaches to governance and political economy being pursued all over the world. And the problem is that the structures of global governance that we've inherited from the neoliberal era are actually very limited, both in scope and ambition. For a long while, the dominant view was that little more was required than effective rules for managing competition between national economies. And from this perspective, the IMF provided surveillance of financial risk and maintained the international financial order. The World Bank offered technical and other support to the development efforts of poorer countries, and the WTO negotiated an ostensibly ever more open global trading regime. It's also really significant that the global management and amelioration of climate change has in this era been pursued within a United Nations framework and has therefore sat outside the responsibilities of these otherwise quite well connected, interconnected set of global institutions. Well, that system surely can't be thought much of a success today. Had it performed even the modest task for which it was designed, we wouldn't have experienced the great financial crisis of 2008, 9 and onwards, and we wouldn't have suffered the subsequent Great Recession, and we wouldn't now be witnessing more or less complete lack of progress in both the ongoing WTO trade round and the United Nations climate change talks. Clearly something isn't working, and it looks actually as if it hasn't been working for quite a while. The current neoliberal system of global governance seems to be locked in a mode of endemic indecision. As I've said, it wasn't that ambitious in the first place, but it doesn't seem any longer as if it can strike the deals that are needed to keep even its limited aspirations airborne. The shifting, in a nutshell, the shifting balance of power amongst the leading states of the world has made things incredibly more complex and has made it very, very hard to strike the kind of deals that once could be struck between the US and Europe, with Japan acquiescing and everyone else being dragged along behind them. In other words, we need something better. We need something more intensive, more sophisticated as a system of global government. And picking up on Keith's introductory point, something underpinned by a moral vision of how we want the world to be run, precisely so that then citizens in different countries can decide how they want their own political economies organised in accordance with their own values, culture, history, geography, and so on. Now that sounds like a hugely tall order, but the good news is that we can have it because we've had it before. We had it in the era from 1944, roughly, to the beginning of the 1970s, roughly, within what we have always labelled the Bretton Woods era. But by the same token, the less good news is that in this new era, characterised by much greater openness and interdependence, we can't just hope to go back to Bretton Woods. We can't hope to create a new Bretton Woods simply by emulating the form taken by a series of bygone institutions. Many projects and things have tried to do this. I think they've all broadly failed. They've tended to look back rather than looking forward. Looking forward, Colin and I think that the key question that has to be asked is, as all key questions are, dead easy to pose and much harder to answer. The question is, what might a global hosting system capable of supporting various different plural national models of civic capitalism look like? And we suggest very briefly in the book, and this is the bit I'm dissatisfied with, we do no more than really, I think, sketch the framework. We suggest in the book that it would have to possess at least the following four characteristics. First of all, better global governance does need a renewed and an extended vision. And actually we're lucky here because on this front a great opportunity is presenting itself, and this is the process going on already intensively at the United Nations, whereby the former Millennium Development Goals are being reworked for the post-2015 era. And whatever one thinks of the limitations of the so-called MDGs, they have unquestionably been hugely influential in setting the tone of global ambition for a decade or more now. But what we need to do now, we think, is to take a step further forward by adding in goals that explicitly seek to reduce inequality within and between countries. In other words, we're suggesting that the post-2015 vision of global governance should be to genuinely make globalization more inclusive. And of course, actually, to make it genuinely global in that sense. Globalization is one of those things that isn't actually comprehensively global in its impact for all of the easy use of the word. So that's point one. Second, better global governance also requires, we think, a coordinating agency to take responsibility for steering the global political economy. Well, again, we're looking. Because of the rather panicky move taken by, would you believe it, President George W. Bush in the autumn of 2008, we do now have in existence something called the Group of 20, in existence at the level of leaders and heads of government. By common consent, it's fallen away a bit in effectiveness and unity following quite an impressive start in the immediate height of the crisis. But it's still there. It has the great advantage of representing via its 20 member states somewhere between 80 and 90% of global domestic product and global trade. It has the capacity to steer. It has the capacity to provide the political will and muscle to underpin global governance if it seeks to organise itself to do that. And so a second priority, we think, must be to think very hard about how to improve the current rather sloppy modus operandi of that organisation. Third, there's only 4 points, don't worry. Third, better global governance must be grounded within a truly coherent set of global governance institutional pillars, all of which take their political lead from the G20. Now, the global governance pillars we have at the moment have been made more interconnected and institutionalized than they were, but they have been essentially set up in an ad hoc fashion from the mid-1940s through to the 1980s. But the fact that we already have present on the scene the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, now the Financial Stability Board, is, we think, a good starting point. Now, of course, on the left, often these bodies are bitterly condemned for their unblinking, single-minded, rigid imposition of doctrines on diverse countries around the world, and there's a lot of truth in that critique. But don't forget too that in, if you like, US Tea Party circles, these bodies are seen as one of the great Satans, as constituting an embryonic world state which must be brought down with urgency. Our perspective is that these institutions need to be defended and improved. But perhaps what does urgently need to be added to the mix is some mechanism to bring climate change in from outside the debate about the global political economy, where it currently largely sits, into dialogue with the IMF, the bank, the Stability Board, and so on. And if that means we have to create another global institution to do it, then I think that's the price that we have to pay. Fourth and finally, better global governance has to be facilitated. It can only work if it is facilitated by more deliberation, debate and argument at the global level about global choices and options. In other words, all the top-down moves I've been talking about have to be complemented by equally important new bottom-up initiatives or moves. This is really vital, and it's often neglected, and it's integral, actually, to us having any chance of making the institutions of global governance respond to a civic capitalist agenda. So what do we mean here? We mean deliberation with a hard edge, as between politicians and state representatives in the UN and all of its organizations, but we also mean deliberation with a soft edge, as manifested in the activism of global civil society, in the Global Academy of Ideas, of which we're part, and also, although yet I think to an insufficient degree, in us having access to a more globally oriented media. Now, all of that is really what I criticise. I mean, I think that stands up as a framework, but these are manifestly only very early and embryonic thoughts, and I'm still dissatisfied with the amount of flesh that, in this book at least, we've so far succeeded in putting on those relatively bare bones. There's a lot more for Sperry to do on this front, and we're trying to do it. But what is clear, and this is really my final and summary thought, what I would put to you on behalf of Colin and myself, for all of the natural focus on Britain at the moment in this late stage of an election campaign, what I would want to leave you with is the thought that only within a reformed world order does civic capitalism in Britain, or anywhere else for that matter, have a chance of surviving, let alone prospering. In other words, putting that argument the other way around, if we can't also find a way to work together differently and better as citizens of a global order, then national projects of civic capitalism risk being strangled at birth, and that would be deeply unfortunate, to put it mildly. Thank you very much.
So that means you have to buy the next book too. But now we're going to Ed Cox, who's the director of IPPR North, to talk to us. Actually, it's actually come all the way from Manchester via London. So thank you very much for getting back here tonight, Ed Cox.
Thank you very much, and it's a real privilege to be here. Lovely to be here launching somebody else's book. I think last time I was speaking in Sheffield. I was in the room next door with the Deputy Prime Minister launching our report on decentralisation decade. So it's lovely to actually be able to talk about somebody else's rather than, if you like, defend your own your own work. But it's quite unlike any other book launch I've been to. Normally everybody's sort of standing around with glasses of wine.
We'll do that in a minute.
I'm sure we are going to do that in a minute. And we've heard two absolutely brilliant, eloquent speeches, really, about the nature of the book and the very, very important issues within it. Now, I've got some things which I think are important to say, but I've done mine in a slightly more light-hearted way, so forgive me. Forgive me if I change the tone slightly in the way in which I want to approach my comments on what as I say, I think is a really, really important book. I had a bit of an existential crisis last week. I was on holiday in Portugal, reading the book and feeling really torn as to, and my kids would say, "Why are you getting so angry?" You know, and it was partly because the truths that you speak to in the book are so very real, about inequality and the kind of inequality and the unequal life, if you like, that I lead. And it really kind of brought it home to me and made me think about, hang on a second, exactly how are we living our lives? And, you know, writing my speech on the back of my blinking boarding card, you know, made me think, actually, there is still something fundamentally wrong which challenges us all personally, which I think this book does. It's not just an academic read in that sense. It's something which I think needs to get to all of us and our own behaviours, and it's certainly done that. I've been director of IPPR North for 5 years, and from the start, I have always had a bit of a catchphrase for IPPR North, which is that we want to make the north of England the place to be for progressive policy making. And many people have laughed at me, really, to quite literally said, "Oh, how on earth is that ever going to be the case?" But I'm absolutely delighted to be part of the launch of this book here in Sheffield, because I genuinely believe that the north of England can be, and is to a large degree, very much at the forefront of progressive policy making in Europe. When we think about, you know, Wilkinson and Pickett down the road, so to speak, and we think about the great work that's coming out of Liverpool and Manchester and Newcastle and Durham, some of those universities in the social sciences in particular, which is what I'm most concerned, but generally the great things that are going on there. I think it is really, really important that we do kind of seize this moment, that the north of England is very much, if you like, on the map in terms of progressive policy making. And I think more than that, I'm really pleased that the foundations, if you like, of a new political economy are being forged not in an inaccessible 500-page tome by somebody with a very exotic surname, but actually in a straightforward essay from two rather ordinary sounding blokes from the north of England. Forgive me. But I would argue Piketty, Stieglitz, Unger, Skidelsky, eat your heart out, because here we have a book on political economy, a serious book on political economy, but which can reach a much, much wider audience who might read it and indeed understand it as well. And I think that's absolutely key. And these opening comments are not intended to be patronising in any way, so forgive me if that's the impression people have got. But I think they do imply two things. First of all, I think it's about time that someone started doing some political economy in a more plural and more participative fashion. And I think that one of the reasons that perhaps the kind of new social, political, economic paradigm that we're all seeking seems to be so slow in emerging from the crisis in 2008 is because, even despite living in an age of global communications and all the rest of it, too few academics have made a genuine attempt to reach out to the general public with their ideas and their work in the way in which I think Tony and Colin have tried to do in this book. And I think it's very, very important that this book is much more accessible than many others of a similar kind. The second implication, though, is that in the interests of perhaps brevity, accessibility, the essay, the beginning essay on civic capitalism, I think risks being read in an oversimplistic fashion, and at points you could say, well, it's a bit naive on this and that and the other. And to this extent, I think it leaves itself wide open for critique, both from the left and from the right. And the lovely thing, though, about it, as Tony's already set out, is that then it doesn't run scared of that critique. Indeed, it devotes no fewer than 9 chapters, where essentially different critics, critical friends possibly, really give the notion of civic capitalism a good going over. I think it's fair to say. But that is what makes the book so good. That's what makes the book so vibrant and so lively. And frankly, it's not about the book, it's about the concept civic capitalism. That's what makes civic capitalism, I think, ultimately, something we need to discuss and engage in, because in the very nature of the term, it is something that we need to debate and discuss and to talk about. So that's why I think it's so important that it's the kind of book that it is. And I would argue that never before has it been so important that there is a public debate about the kinds of issues that are raised by the concept of civic capitalism. I was very struck by Andrew Gamble's reflection in this book that Keynes didn't write his general theory until 8 years after the 1929 crash. And it wasn't until then, the mid-40s, before that actually translated into public policy of any kind. So, again, assuming that despite our hyper-communicative society, it still takes humans and their economies that same kind of length of time to actually process crises and work through their implications and transform their policy and practice, we perhaps shouldn't expect the next great leap forward in political and economic thinking until at least next year. So again, Getty, bad luck. It wasn't you. And in terms of policy implications, we perhaps shouldn't expect to see any real policy implications emerging out of this kind of debate until not the next general election, but actually the one after that. So I think we need to put ourselves in a certain time frame and understand then the importance of this intervention, this book, this notion of civic capitalism from that point of view. But what I think this book does is it gives us an engaging framework. It gives us there's 9 kind of principles or concepts or foundations, whatever you want to call them, within the book, and it gives us something to actually work with, and it creates the space for that kind of thinking to be done. So it's in the spirit of that public dialogue, if you like, around civic capitalism that I want to offer just 3 short reflections on my reading of some of the ideas in there. I'm partly picking up on some of the themes that were touched on by the 9 critical friends, but I'm also trying to offer a view here of somebody who tries to bridge the gap all the time between the social scientists, what Keynes, I learnt in this book, calls the academic scribblers, and then those who hold political power, which Keynes calls the madmen in authority. And I feel as a think tanker, we're constantly trying to do that bridging job all the time. And so my first reflection comes very much from that point of view. And I think I share quite strongly the perspective that's put so eloquently by Mick Moran in the book, that the this concept has civic at its heart, this idea of civic capitalism, it's a great pity there isn't more in the book about political reform and what the civic bit might actually look like, and the role, if you like, of civic institutions, including the political parties. And I don't know whether to laugh or to cry about the current election campaign. I don't know if you're with me on that one. On the one hand, we've got the two big parties, and Colin's done a brilliant job already of making me cry about some of the things that they're saying. Sort of the two big parties, I would put it this way, dancing around their Anglo-liberal capitalist handbags, as if nothing much really has happened in the past decade, and austerity is going to sort it out. But then, on the other hand, we've had a really important democratic moment in Scotland, which has given us all, I think, whether you live north or south of the border, a glimpse of the kind of politics that is actually possible, and helped us to realise that austerity economics is not necessarily the only game in town. And what I find quite interesting, and John and I were musing about this beforehand, is the emergence of what we at IPPR North call these new political voices in the north, the likes of Yorkshire First, the likes of the North East Party, the growth in membership of the Green Party. And I have a real sense that I don't think they're going to win many seats at the next election, don't misunderstand me, but I think they will build their support. And I think over time there is the likelihood of a progressive northern rainbow coalition, if you like, which takes on some of the agenda and narrative that the mainstream political parties are working with. And that is, if you like, at the vanguard of the kind of political economy that I think civic capitalism points us towards. So I think watch this space in terms of that whole kind of political reform and that kind of movement. I think that we might see more of that in Northern England. Which brings me to my second reflection. And I think this is a new contribution to the civic capitalism debate. It's certainly not a new topic for discussion, but certainly I don't see it and read it in the book. Tony's just sort of articulated very, very well, if you like, the international dimensions of this new political economic order. But I think we need to articulate much more carefully the local dimensions of what civic capitalism needs to be about. And I'll go further and say that I think that the nation state is the wrong frame of reference for building civic capitalism. I haven't really got time to go into a big kind of theory of city-states and why I think the idea of a 60 million strong, over-centralised state fundamentally wedded to an Anglo-liberal core periphery model of economic development is going to fail. But I do think in the next 50 years it is going to fail. And I do think that essentially the future is, for want of a better term, federal, and that it is built around what I would call large metro regions. Now we can have a great debate, can't we, about exactly what the shape of those large metro regions looks like, but that for me is the kind of basis that I think civic capitalism will grow around. Some might argue that competing city-states might lead to the kind of worst kind of Anglo-liberal capitalism, and you only have to look across the US to see precisely what I mean by that, where cities get completely left behind and cut off and so on. But that's not actually the kind of model that I'm trying to describe. I think there's something different about a larger metro region and a federal state with a population size which manages to share risk and so on in a more effective way. And so I take a very optimistic stance, and I would argue that whether it's in Scotland or Yorkshire or whether it's in the whole of the north of England, we actually stand a far better chance of nurturing the kind of civic capitalist values that are advocated in this book at that level, linking into then the international dimension that that Tony's talked about earlier. And I think that's the way we need to be thinking and working, and I'm delighted John's here, and no doubt there are people here from other cities, because I think that's the opportunity that devolution in England is actually playing into. And as we see devolved powers going to combined authorities, to bigger metro regions, I think they are the places where, with some bottom-up push from the general public as well, we stand a much greater chance of nurturing the ideas that are in the book around civic capitalism than trying to do it as a nation state with this massive unwieldy London and all its issues and problems and its complete weddedness to an Anglo-liberal model. So that's where I think there's some huge opportunities. Put simply, civic capitalism necessarily needs to be closer to people. And I think that large metro regions are probably the most likely spatial scale for its propagation. So my final reflection, it's less of a critique and more of an exhortation. I recently heard a talk by Jeremy Rifkin on the zero marginal cost society. I don't know if people have come across this idea, but I would definitely look out for it and listen to Jeremy Rifkin. And what struck me about him was, and about his ideas as well, was that his presentation about the future and what this zero marginal cost society is going to look like was entirely optimistic. It was entirely positive. It was entirely exciting and engaging. Now, he may not be coming from the same kind of camp as many of us are here, but his, if you like, premonition of the end of capitalism, as we know it at the moment, seems to be all the more exciting and engaging than anything I think we, and I put myself in this box as well, kind of talk about and dream up, and the language we use around political and social sciences. And I want to make a case, and forgive me, that this book still starts from a negative premise. It starts, at least 2/3 of the book, I would say, is still generally a critique of the current system and the issues that we've faced since 2008. And that is so important and so necessary, so I'm not knocking that. But even where the book does posit a transformational agenda, too often it takes on the language of antidotes and regulations and alternatives to the present. And I think that what we really need is something, a language which is more visionary, more optimistic, and we learn from, if you like, the futurologists and the innovators and the way in which they talk about the future. So my exhortation is really very simple. Let's not be apologists for a civic capitalism. Let's not be just cynics about the current state of play. Let's instead be the champions of a new social, economic and political vision. I think that's what this book pushes us towards, but we've got to find the language to actually do that. Let's stir up the debate right here in the north of England, so that as the drip, drip, drip of devolution gathers pace, we can once again in the north be ahead in terms of establishing that new political and economic order that I think most of us want to see. And as Tony and Colin make abundantly clear through their enterprise and engagement, I think we really can make the north of England the home of progressive policy making in this new economic era that we want to see. So I want to just finish by saying thank you to Tony and Colin on behalf of everybody. I'm sure perhaps kids are going to do that as well, but just say thank you for stimulating such a fantastic debate. And if we can just show our appreciation in the normal way, then
Thank you, Ed. I think I'll close down the criticism now. The book's bloody marvellous and you have to buy it. And actually there'll be booze at the back, so we're reverting to the normal mode of a book launch. Let's enjoy ourselves. But also, thank you very much to Colin and to Tony and to Ed. Thank you very much indeed, Ed, for that. I think it was a terrific speech, actually. It's wonderful. And let's go and join the authors and the people here and carry on talking about it. So let's have a drink, let's have a discussion, and thank you all for coming here this evening. Thank you.